Hello, everyone. My name is J.R. Harris, and today I'm going to be talking about treating your art like a performance while we look at this drawing of the Happy Mask Salesman. So, what do I mean by this treating your art like a performance? It's a bit of an abstract thought, but as I explain the drawing process, it should start to make a little bit more sense. First off, I get my references arranged and start to establish the layout for the drawing. I'm thinking about the placement of the characters, the background, the angles, and so on. And this is putting my foundation knowledge to the test a bit, the elements of design and perspective. Because really what I'm doing here is just broad strokes, just basic shapes to kind of get things moving as I move into the actual details of the character. There's plenty of references here, like the shape of his face, the clothing, the giant traveler's bag full of masks. So I have a lot to work off of, so the actual layout process doesn't take too long, and I can really start diving into these character details pretty quickly. So diving into this idea of the performance, I don't mean performance in the sense that you're drawing your art in front of people. I'm more talking about like what is required to give a great performance. And let's say like in sports or in music, you have the build-up, the planning, the practice, and then finally the actual performance itself. It's not just diving straight headfirst in, usually. In a way, an art piece is very similar to this concept. These character details that I'm drawing right now aren't the final drawing. It's just the sketching to help me find that final drawing. I can be a little sketchier with the lines and kind of explore the drawing a little bit. This sketching is similar to practicing for a music concert. You're figuring out what works and what doesn't. And throughout this process, you'll see me making like little subtle changes before actually getting to the final line art. This is the step that helps you understand what that final performance is going to sound like, or in this case, what the final drawing will look like. In this case, I'm redrawing his hair a few times to really make sure that I'm happy with it, instead of just going with the first iteration. These little steps will just really make your final piece just that much better. And the cool thing about such a detailed character is that I'm really looking at his big details. This golden necklace kind of thing he's got going on, the bracelets, and then the giant bag full of masks are really specific details, and I really want to get the information correct. Instead of diving headfirst into a final drawing where I have to keep drawing and redrawing the details and not being happy with it, I can just loosely throw in the details in there, play with it for a little while, and then eventually I'm finding what I need. Finding the information I need to give myself, essentially. This kind of work really plays into the importance of foundation and sketching and taking your time with it and being okay to erase things, to move things around, to resize. I even resized the salesman's head a little bit because I realized it just wasn't quite what I wanted from the drawing. And I realized his head was a little bit bigger and he's got a little bit more of a lanky demeanor. So I spent some time and really made sure I figured that out instead of just diving right into the first version. These vanishing points in perspective are really important to bring the life and accuracy to the background that's around the character. And I know that if I spend the time drawing out the actual grid work for the perspective, that I know the final drawing will look better. When you perform at the music concert, you want to be ready and confident that you can play the music just the way you practice. And the same goes for the art piece. The character details, the perspective, the background, you want to make sure that everything is properly prepared before diving into the final line work. And I know for a fact that improvising with the perspective can sometimes lead to things not looking quite right and having to go back anyway and do this grid work. I really enjoy doing perspective and backgrounds and doing it correctly. And so when I get a little lazy and improvise, things don't always go the right way. But if I spend the time and make it look right, I know I'm going to be a lot happier. So why not spend the time and actually build it up the correct way? instead of having to do it later, inevitably, when I get frustrated and try to improvise it. Backgrounds are, like I said, a really big thing for my artwork. Not everybody enjoys doing backgrounds, and not everybody enjoys doing characters as much. There's landscape artists, there's character artists. I try to sit in the middle a little bit and make sure I put enough time equally into the background as I do into the character. Clearly, the Happy Mask Salesman is much more detailed and has a lot more specific details. But I wanted to make sure that the railing that's next to him, even though it doesn't look identical to the game, it still kind of gives that intricacy to it. When you kind of glance at it, you realize, like, oh yeah, it's kind of fancy looking compared to just a simple railing. I wanted to give a little bit more time into it. So the final line art starts, and now, in the analogy, you're reaching the final performance. You've practiced, you've prepared, and now's the time to start the final piece. And this is a frustrating element, is that the important thing to remember is that this final piece, this final line work, is what your audience will see. They'll probably not see the hours of work or practice that you went into preparing, but only see the finished performance that you give. In this case, obviously, I'm doing a time lapse to show the process, but I can't do that with every single drawing that I do, because that's just too time consuming. I end up putting a lot more work into it. So it's very interesting to have that same mentality when you're applying to your artwork, is that all of that hard work is going to be seen in that performance or in that final line work. So you might as well put as much work into that final piece and the final line work as you can. As I work on the line art, the foundation is there to work off of. But I want to address that different mediums call for different approaches. Clearly, if you're going to be painting a portrait, you wouldn't be tracing over line art that you did. You might trace over some sketchy pencil that you might put down, but fundamentally, it's hard to just sketch out colors without actually applying the paint itself. Typically, when you're painting a portrait or a landscape, you might actually paint smaller versions of the painting to get an idea of color and of layout, work out the kinks, and explore what you want that final piece to look like. Every medium has its own approach, but fundamentally they require the same type of care. With the paintings, you have the little paintings. With the type of ink drawing that I'm doing here, you have the sketchy pencils planning things out. They're different approaches, fundamentally the same idea. Something I want to mention too is that just because I spend a lot of time on the foundation in the sketching doesn't mean that it's exactly what I have to stick with. The performance analogy works in this case too, because you have to be ready for improvising to fit certain needs. Like as an example, as like a music concert, you might have to cut songs, you might have to change the set list, play something a little louder than you practiced. It's never going to be an exact experience. And with sketching and doing line art the way I'm doing it, line art is clean. I have to try the line multiple times to get it to be the right line. So it's not the exact same experience, but at least I've prepared myself a bit more for this final piece. It's just part of the performance, and it's important to just go with the flow and take the time necessary, to make things come together and to be happy with your final line art or your final performance. It's good to recognize the foundation as a guideline. It's essentially there to help you make that final performance better. But it's not necessarily going to be a perfect word for word or line for line recreation. And if there's something about if when you're working on the final performance or the final line work in this case, if you're working on it and something's just not working and you've tried it again and again, it might be good to take a step back and work more on the foundation again. And this is kind of where the performance concept is kind of nice, where if you're not drawing something live in front of people and you have it doing it on your own time, you have the time to take a step back. Sometimes we get fed up with an art piece and just move on, and then like when we come back, we kind of have a fresh perspective and see what's wrong with it or see some things that we can improve on. And fixing the foundation before trying to dive headfirst into the actual line work will help make that line work better. It's a better chance to see those mistakes or those little tweaks you have to make before you get to that point. Another element of this drawing specifically is that since there is such a great reference for the Happy Mask Salesman, it's nice to be able to just pull the colors straight from the references instead of having to necessarily find my own at first. Typically what I do is I will pull straight from the reference and then kind of fill those in. Especially with this type of artwork, it's a little more of a bold color, basic. There isn't much lighting or light perspective going on, or light foundation going on. And so there's just basic shading of the color. So I will do that first, and then I will start to tweak the colors a little bit and mess with balances and really see what I like versus like what the actual reference is. It's a good starting point, but I never like to just take directly from the reference and call it a day. I like to make sure that I'm adding my own personality to it. It's important to realize the analogy of this whole performance concept. It's just, in my mind, a motivator to help spend more time in the preparation and the foundation. Because it will get the final work looking better. It helps put the right amount of focus where it needs to, and it's not meant to put pressure on yourself. Usually, when you think of a performance, it's kind of intimidating, or it could be if if you're not used to performing in front of people. The idea of a performance is an intimidating concept. So it's not meant to be viewed as such an intimidating way, but more of a way of seeing where you need to put your the important parts to make your final piece a little bit better. Overall, I'd say if you feel like an art piece doesn't come together the way you wanted, or you're seeing that your artwork isn't, like your art pieces just aren't quite right, maybe spending more time on the perspective, the anatomy, the elements of it, like the actual design, working on that a little bit longer before really spending time on the finished piece will help make those pieces a lot better. The more practice you put in, the better the performance will be. That's kind of the fundamental takeaway, I think, from this. I hope that the abstract analogy here helps and it doesn't confuse. I think the way seeing my process while discussing this helps to get an idea a little bit more, and not rushing not rushing into the final piece, but putting time into the foundation and making sure you're happy with the art piece before you do that final performance. Thanks for tuning into today's topic. I have a few more videos coming out soon. One is the steps for success, which talks a bit about the steps you can take to achieve success in creative endeavors. I talk a little bit about like pursuing careers or going into freelancing and just building habits and whatnot, and the kind of the lifestyle to have when trying to achieve some success. So keep an eye on that soon. This one was a lot of fun to work on, and I'm glad that this analogy kind of came together. Thanks again for checking this out. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a little bit of a different analogy of an abstract concept, but it was a lot of fun to try to figure out and to talk about today. Thanks again for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.